It all started with a tiny, innocent comment, a throwaway line I didn't even think twice about. We were lying on the couch, scrolling on our phones, and I casually mentioned that a friend of mine from college had gotten promoted to partner at her law firm. I meant it as a passing comment, just one of those little things you mention in the daily flow of life. But the way he looked up from his phone, eyebrows raised, fell off. After a long pause, he said, "So what, you think I should be at her level by now?" I was stunned. The idea that my comment would make him feel judged had never even crossed my mind. "No, not at all," I said quickly, trying to smooth things over. "I was just saying it's kind of cool, that's all." He shrugged and went back to scrolling. But there was this new chill in the air, a silence that somehow felt louder than words. I wanted to say more, to explain myself better, but I also didn't want to make things worse by harping on it. So I let it go. At least I thought I did. But after that, everything I said seemed to feel loaded with some hidden meaning or judgment that only he could see. I started second-guessing every little word, overthinking whether a simple comment would trigger another reaction like that. And somehow, without even realizing it, I started pulling back, keeping things to myself that I'd usually want to share. It was as if, bit by bit, I was disappearing into the relationship. The strangest part was that we were still together every day, doing all the same things. Yet it felt like he couldn't actually see me. I'd bring up something from work or talk about a random thought, but his responses became perfunctory. "Cool. That's nice." It was like talking into a void, like I could have been anyone saying anything, and his responses wouldn't change. I was right there next to him, but I'd never felt so invisible in my life. The hardest part was trying to understand why it was happening. I'd wonder if I'd actually done something wrong, something that justified his reactions, or if I was just too sensitive, reading too much into it. I spent hours analyzing every interaction, replaying conversations in my mind, searching for clues. Maybe we were just wired differently. Maybe his family wasn't big on talking things through, while mine had a habit of dissecting every emotion to death. But even that excuse started to wear thin after a while. I tried to be more understanding, to approach things with patience. I'd tell myself, maybe he's just tired, or he's going through a rough patch. Give him space. But every time I took a step back, he seemed to drift further away. And if I did try to bridge the distance and share how I felt, he'd get defensive. "Not everything has to be so intense, you know," he'd say, sounding more annoyed than understanding. The more I tried to get through to him, the more I felt like a nuisance, like the emotional one who couldn't just let things go. After a while, it got to the point where I didn't feel safe bringing up anything meaningful at all. I'd bring up a story from my day, something small, and he'd find a way to make it feel like I was nagging or complaining. Or worse, he'd barely react at all, making me feel like I was just talking to myself. I started to realize that even the simplest conversations were becoming these tense, guarded exchanges where I was constantly navigating around invisible tripwires. Then came the night I finally decided we had to talk. Really talk. I couldn't keep brushing this under the rug and pretending everything was okay. I picked a moment when we were both relaxed, hoping the timing would help, and I asked if we could talk for a minute. He looked up, visibly bracing himself. "Here we go," he said, with a tone that immediately put me on edge. I took a deep breath and started slowly, trying to keep my words as clear as I could. "I feel like we're drifting, like we're both here, but not really seeing each other anymore." He didn't respond right away, just sat there with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the coffee table, as if he couldn't look at me directly. Finally, he muttered, "You're always so dramatic about this stuff. Things are fine. We're just comfortable." I tried to stay calm, but his words hit me like a slap. Comfortable? Was this what comfortable was supposed to feel like? I searched his face, hoping to find some sign that he understood what I was trying to say, that he could feel the distance between us two. But he just looked tired, and maybe even a little irritated, as if I was wasting his time. "I just need to feel like you're listening," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "Like you care about what I'm saying." He sighed. "Of course I care. You're just looking for problems where there aren't any." It felt like a door slamming shut. In that moment, I realized that he wasn't just missing my point. He was dismissing it, as if my feelings were an inconvenience. I could feel my throat tightening, a familiar pressure of unshed tears that I didn't want him to see. I wanted to shake him, to make him understand how lonely I felt, how much I needed him to see me, really see me. But standing there, looking at the blank expression on his face, I knew I was wasting my breath. The days after that conversation were even worse. We barely spoke. I felt like I was tiptoeing around him, avoiding any topic that might lead to more tension. Even sharing a meal became something formal, like we were coworkers sharing a table, both waiting for the clock to signal it was okay to leave. Every word felt loaded. Every glance, another reminder of the widening chasm between us. I wanted to reach out, to try one last time, but my heart couldn't take another rejection. At night, I'd lie awake, listening to his steady breathing beside me, wondering when exactly we had stopped feeling like partners and started feeling like strangers sharing a bed. I wondered if there was anything left to salvage, or if I was just prolonging the inevitable by staying silent and pretending things would magically improve. So, here I am, asking for help. Is there a way to fix communication issues when you feel like you're the only one who even sees there's a problem? Is it possible to break through to someone who doesn't seem to want to be reached? I don't know if I'm holding on to something that's already gone, or if I just need to try harder. But how much harder can you try when you're already exhausted? So, this guy once caught my eye in a way I didn't expect. I was at a small concert with some friends, and in between sets, I went outside to get some air. I guess he noticed the same escape route, because he ended up sitting a few feet away from me on the bench, both of us quietly sipping our drinks. It was one of those rare moments where neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with forced words, and I appreciated that. After a while, he finally turned to me and said, "Do you think they'll ever get a decent sound system in there?" With a grin. I laughed, and we launched into this whole casual back and forth about the lousy acoustics, our favorite venues, and random shows we'd seen. There was never this big moment where he flipped some switch to make it obvious he was interested. He just kept things easy and open. Before I even realized it, I was actually leaning in, eager to hear more about his story, because he wasn't trying to reel me in or press for anything. When he finally stood up to go back inside, he just said, "If you're still around later, maybe I'll see you," and left it at that. Honestly, that openness made the rest of the night more fun, because now I was the one scanning the crowd hoping to catch a glimpse of him. No pressure, no game playing, just a shared moment that had space to grow naturally if it was meant to. Now, in comparison, there was this other time that felt like a bad rom-com gone wrong. I was on a subway ride home from work, headphones on, zoning out, when I noticed someone waving at me from across the aisle. I looked up, confused, and took out an earbud, thinking maybe I'd dropped something or he needed help. Instead, he points to his phone, which has this giant, flashing text on it that says, "Hello, beautiful." I try to be polite and give him a nod, hoping that would be the end of it, but no. He took that as a green light and actually slid over to sit beside me. He started asking questions at a rapid-fire pace. "Are you from around here? Do you take this train every day? Got a boyfriend?" I gave him short answers, putting my headphones back in after each one, but he didn't pick up on any of it. The whole subway car could practically feel the awkwardness radiating off of me, but he just kept going, determined to somehow break through my silence. Finally, I had to say, "Hey, I'm just trying to get home." He looked shocked, like he hadn't realized he was basically boxing me into a corner with nowhere to escape. There's a reason headphones are the universal do not disturb sign. Sometimes the simplest boundaries are the hardest to respect. One of my favorite approaches, though, was at this beach party of all places. I'd been walking along the shore, kind of caught up in my own thoughts, when this guy jogged past and then stopped a few yards ahead to turn back and say, "I have a serious question. How many times do you think I'll have to jog past before I actually get your attention?" It was such a ridiculous, self-aware thing to say that I couldn't help but laugh. He shrugged and said, "I figured it was worth a shot. Jogging isn't exactly my style anyway." There was something so relaxed about it, as if he didn't care one way or another, but was genuinely up for a laugh. We ended up sitting in the sand, just talking about everything from the worst party fails to our favorite road trips, and it felt like we'd known each other for ages. He wasn't trying to impress me with stories or steer the conversation to make himself look good. He was just easygoing, throwing out random, funny observations and listening to mine. It was nice because he never made it feel like a big deal. He gave me room to be myself without expectations or pretense, and that made the connection feel completely natural. What's funny is that the best interactions I've had are the ones where the guy gives me a way out without making it feel awkward. Like, there's a genuine quality to someone who's just being open and not treating the interaction as if it's his one shot. It's that lack of expectation that makes me curious to keep talking. It was a whirlwind romance. I met Liam through a mutual friend on one of those lazy, coffee-soaked Sunday afternoons, and he had this way of looking at me that made me feel like the only person in the room. His gaze was intense, full of something I couldn't name but couldn't look away from either. It wasn't just his looks or his charm, though, trust me, he had both in spades, but how he seemed to know exactly how to make me feel special. Within a week, he was sending thoughtful texts, planning these dreamy dates, and asking me questions that were so deep and specific that I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone before. By the end of our first month together, I was hooked, believing I'd found my soulmate, someone who was both thrillingly unpredictable and deeply caring. It's funny how quickly the small quirks you brush off as endearing can start to take a darker shape. At first, it was all just a little too good to be true. He seemed invested in my every thought, interested in every detail of my life. But he also had this possessive streak that I mistook for passion. He'd insist on spending as much time together as possible, and when I told him I needed a night with my friends, he'd look hurt, then sigh and say, "I just want to be close to you. Isn't that what people in love do?" I'd feel a twinge of guilt, like maybe I was the one not investing enough. But little by little, his concern morphed into something else. Liam started showing up unexpectedly when I was out, joining me at places where I hadn't invited him. Once, I casually mentioned that I'd be grabbing drinks with a friend from work, and later that night, there he was at the bar pretending it was some wild coincidence. My friends would joke about it, and I'd laugh, telling myself he was just thoughtful and couldn't stay away from me. But there was a part of me that felt uneasy, like his presence was more about control than affection. One day, he surprised me by showing up at my apartment while I was at work, bringing groceries and leaving a batch of comfort food he'd made. At first, it felt like a sweet gesture, but then I started noticing little things out of place, like books shifted, personal letters that had clearly been touched. When I asked him about it, he'd brush it off, saying he was just trying to get to know me better, that it was his way of being thoughtful. He'd follow it with compliments about how unique I was or how much he'd missed me, and I'd feel myself soften, pushing the weirdness aside. Then came the blame. On our bad days, which were becoming disturbingly frequent, Liam would nitpick everything I did or said. If I spent too much time talking about work, he'd accuse me of putting my career before him. If I didn't text back right away, he'd joke, "What, do you have a secret life?" But there was an edge to it, a bitterness that always left me off balance, feeling like I had to prove something. One night, after a small argument over something so insignificant I don't even remember, he stormed out, only to come back hours later, accusing me of being cold-hearted and selfish. He told me if I just tried harder, we wouldn't be having these issues. I remember apologizing, feeling like I had to make up for something, though I couldn't even put my finger on what it was. Slowly, I started questioning myself constantly. Was I really that selfish? Was I demanding too much independence? I'd catch myself tiptoeing around my own life, trying to predict his mood, trying to make sure everything was in order so he wouldn't explode or make some passive-aggressive comment that would haunt me for hours. It felt like I was always a step away from setting him off, even though I couldn't say how or why. He'd tell me I was lucky to have someone who cared as much as he did, that he put his whole heart into our relationship, and I should be grateful. Somewhere along the way, I started believing him, thinking maybe I wasn't good enough for this amazing guy who on some days seemed to adore me beyond reason. Eventually, the strain started to show. I'd always been close with my sister, but I stopped answering her calls regularly, afraid she'd pick up on the tension. My friends noticed too, asking why I didn't come out much anymore, and I'd make excuses, telling them I was just busy or trying to focus on my relationship. It felt like I was living two lives, the one I showed to everyone else, full of little lies and half-truths, and the one with Liam, where every small step felt like walking on eggshells. One evening, after another argument about something trivial, I'd liked a post from an old friend on social media, Liam spent an hour dissecting every reason I was untrustworthy and uncaring. When I started to cry, he snapped, "Don't act like a victim. You know you bring this on yourself." I realized in that moment how much I'd changed. I barely recognized the person I saw in the mirror. I used to be confident, sure of myself. Now, I was apologizing for things I didn't even believe were wrong, afraid to upset someone who claimed to love me. The turning point came when I stumbled across an article about toxic relationships and found myself in every line. It felt like someone had peeled back the fog that had been clouding my vision for months. I couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't love. This was manipulation, control, and emotional abuse. For the first time, I let myself consider the possibility of leaving, of imagining a life where I didn't have to weigh every action and word out of fear of setting him off. In a rare moment of clarity, I confided in my sister. I remember her silence on the phone, then her gentle words. "You know this isn't normal, right? You don't have to live like this." Those words, simple as they were, stuck with me. The idea that I could choose something else, that I didn't have to stay trapped in this endless cycle of apologies and anxiety, was like a lifeline. Now, I'm trying to gather the strength to take that step, to reclaim my life and leave behind someone who turned me into a version of myself I don't recognize. I know it's going to be hard, but I also know I can't keep living like this. I'm scared, but I'm more afraid of staying. Has anyone else here been through something like this? How did you finally make the decision to leave? And where did you find the strength to follow through? I'd love to hear your stories and advice. When I was 24, I moved back to my hometown after a bad breakup. It was one of those breakups that knocks the wind out of you, leaves you questioning every decision you ever made. My best friend, Chris, was thrilled to have me back. He and I had been inseparable as kids, and even after I moved away, we kept in touch. So, when he invited me to crash at his place for a while, it was a no-brainer. Chris lived with his mom, Linda, after his dad had passed a few years earlier. She was young for a mom, having had Chris when she was in her early 20s. She looked like she hadn't aged a day. It didn't take long to notice how Linda had changed since I'd last seen her. She had this newfound energy, like she was reinventing herself after Chris's dad passed. She had a new job, a new hairstyle, even a new way of dressing, stylish, confident. There was this lightness to her that I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the sadness of losing her husband, or maybe just the fact that she was still discovering who she was outside of being a mom. Whatever it was, it caught my attention more than I cared to admit. One night, Chris decided to have a few friends over for drinks. Nothing too wild, just a casual hangout in his basement. Linda joined us for a bit, sipping a glass of wine and laughing along with us. I'd never seen her so relaxed, so easygoing. She cracked jokes, even playfully teased us about our bad dating stories. I wasn't sure if it was the wine or just the atmosphere, but there was something magnetic about her that night, something that made it hard to look away. I'd always thought of her as Chris's mom, someone who was out of reach, off limits. But that night, she felt like, well, someone I was just meeting for the first time. As the night wound down, Chris went upstairs to grab a few blankets for everyone crashing in the basement. Linda stayed behind, saying she was too tired to head upstairs just yet. For a while, we just sat there in comfortable silence. And then she turned to me and asked, "How are you doing, really?" It was a simple question, but there was so much warmth in her voice that I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't done with anyone else. I told her about the breakup, the way it had blindsided me, and how lost I felt being back in town. She listened intently, her eyes never leaving mine, nodding as if she understood every bit of it. At some point, the conversation took on a softer, more personal tone. She started talking about the loneliness she'd felt after her husband died, the nights spent wondering if she'd ever feel connected to someone again. Her honesty struck a chord in me. It felt like we were sharing something real, something raw. We were sitting close, maybe too close, and when she put a hand on my arm, I felt a jolt of something that had nothing to do with comfort. There was a moment, a breath, where we just looked at each other, both knowing this was dangerous, both too wrapped up to stop. Then, before I knew it, she leaned in, brushing her lips softly against mine. I froze, torn between wanting to pull away and wanting to dive in head first. I could feel her breath, warm and steady, and something in me just gave in. I kissed her back, feeling the years and boundaries melt away in that single moment. There was a tenderness in her touch, a quiet desperation, like she'd been waiting for someone to hold her close. That night, I didn't go back to the basement. We spent the night in her room, wrapped up in each other, both lost in a moment we couldn't and didn't want to explain. There was no guilt in that room, only a strange kind of peace, like we were two people simply finding comfort where we could. The next morning, we woke up before Chris and the others. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and understanding, like she knew this had to be the last time, even if neither of us wanted it to end. This was, she started, searching for words. I nodded, understanding. "It's okay," I whispered, not trusting myself to say more. After that night, things were complicated. We didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it, but there was a tension between us that neither of us could shake. I kept staying at Chris's place, but Linda and I would avoid each other, finding ways to keep the peace. Chris never suspected anything. He was too caught up in his own life to notice the strange silences, the lingering glances. A few weeks later, Linda texted me, asking if I could meet her at a coffee shop in town. My heart raced as I read the message, and I went, both eager and terrified of what she might say. When I arrived, she was already there, waiting with a quiet, almost sad expression. We sat in silence for a moment, the air heavy with things left unsaid. I think we need to put some space between us," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to fight it, to tell her that we could find a way to make this work, even if it didn't make sense. "I just don't want to hurt Chris," she continued, her voice breaking a little. "He's been through enough." I reached across the table, taking her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin one last time. "I get it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But you need to know that night meant something to me." She smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile, and squeezed my hand before letting go. "I know," she said softly. "Me too." After that day, I kept my distance, gradually pulling back, spending less time at Chris's place, finding reasons to stay away. It was hard, harder than I ever expected, but I knew it was the right thing. Linda and I exchanged the occasional glance, a quiet acknowledgement of what we'd shared, but we both knew it had to end there. Eventually, I moved out of town, found a new job, tried to rebuild my life from scratch. Chris and I stayed in touch, though things were never quite the same. Every now and then, he'd mention his mom, tell me about a new hobby she'd picked up or a trip she'd taken. I'd smile, listening to stories of her new life, knowing that in some strange way, I'd always be a part of it, even if only as a quiet, unspoken memory. Years passed, and life went on, but the memory of that summer, of that night, remains with me. It's like a photograph in my mind, a snapshot of a moment that exists outside of time, a memory that's as beautiful as it is bittersweet. I think of Linda now and then, wonder if she remembers it too, or if she's long since put it to rest. But for me, it's a secret I'll carry with me, a part of my past that no one else knows about, a quiet, tender moment shared in the stillness of a summer night. And though it's over, though it's something I'll never speak of, I'm grateful for that memory, for the way it taught me about love, about loss, about the quiet spaces between people where things that can never last are born. The first time I met Clara, it felt like the kind of meet-cute you'd see in a rom-com. I was waiting in line at the local farmer's market, fumbling with my change, when she offered to pay the last dollar I didn't have. When I turned around to thank her, I was struck by this calm, open expression on her face that made her look both wise and playful at the same time. We ended up walking through the market together, chatting about everything from favorite breakfast foods to our shared obsession with obscure historical podcasts. It was such an immediate connection. I felt like I'd known her forever. I remember how my best friend, Jack, laughed when I described her. "Sounds like you're hooked already," he teased. And I was. There were so many green flags. She was warm, emotionally present, genuinely curious about my life, and even seemed to remember every detail I'd shared. She didn't play games or leave me guessing. Clara would text first. She'd make time to see me even if it meant rearranging her schedule, and she actually asked about my family, my friends, and how my day went. I felt like I'd found someone who was not just good for me, but good to me in a way I'd never really experienced before. For the first few months, everything felt like it was moving in the right direction. I introduced her to Jack and some other friends, who were mostly thrilled for me, though one or two raised an eyebrow at how quickly things were progressing. One night, after we all had dinner, my sister, Laura, pulled me aside and said, "Don't you think she's a little intense? Like, it almost seems like she's too focused on you." She said it in that careful way people do when they're trying not to rock the boat, but are still clearly concerned. I brushed it off, thinking maybe Laura was just being overprotective. I mean, who wouldn't want a partner who was attentive and wanted to be close? Then came the first little ripple. We were out with friends, and Clara made an offhand remark about one of my oldest friends, a woman named Sarah, implying there was something weird about our friendship. I laughed it off, explaining that Sarah and I had been friends since childhood, practically family. Clara nodded, but I noticed she stayed unusually quiet for the rest of the night, casting glances towards Sarah that seemed almost critical. Later, on the way home, Clara asked me again about Sarah, subtly questioning our relationship in a way that was almost playful, like she was half joking. "So, you and Sarah never dated? Not even once?" I chuckled, telling her she had nothing to worry about. But she didn't laugh. She simply said, "I just think it's a little strange, that's all." I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe it was just a harmless comment. Over the next few weeks, though, her little insecurities started seeping into more conversations, sometimes so quietly I almost didn't notice. She'd ask about people in my life, almost as if keeping a mental tally of who was close to me and what their roles were. I chalked it up to her being invested in knowing me completely, and maybe even a little protective. Still, it felt off like a violin string that's ever so slightly out of tune. Then came a strange episode at a party we attended together. I was catching up with an old college buddy, laughing over some ridiculous story, and when I turned back to find Clara, I noticed she was standing off to the side, arms crossed, watching me with this tight, uncomfortable smile. When I went over to her, she barely spoke, just took my hand and pulled me outside. "Are you really so eager to hang out with everyone but me?" she asked, her voice low and a little hurt. I tried to explain it away, saying I'd just been catching up with friends, but she didn't seem satisfied. "It's like you're happier when I'm not around," she said, and it was such a weird thing to hear that I didn't even know how to respond. She eventually softened and apologized, brushing it off as a bad night. But it lingered in the back of my mind. Things started getting trickier after that. Clara would occasionally give me silent treatments if I didn't respond to her messages quickly enough, or if I had plans that didn't involve her. Once, she showed up unannounced at my apartment when I was supposed to be hanging out with Jack, and when I let her in, she barely acknowledged him, almost as if he was invisible. After he left, she said she didn't like how much time I spent with him. "Sometimes, I just feel like you'd rather be with anyone else but me," she whispered, eyes downcast. It was heartbreaking. Here was this amazing person, someone I genuinely cared about, who seemed to need constant reassurance that she was my top priority. I tried my best to give her that, spending more and more time with her, but it never seemed to be enough. The more I tried, the more I started feeling isolated from the people who'd been my lifelines for years. The turning point came one night when Clara and I were supposed to go to dinner. She was late, but when she showed up, she was carrying my favorite coffee and a stack of photos she'd printed of our recent outings. She smiled, saying she wanted to surprise me with something special. But as we looked through the pictures, she began making comments that cut a little deeper than usual. Comments about my distraction when we were out with friends, about how she could see it in my eyes that I didn't want her there. It was like she'd rewritten our entire relationship, casting me as someone who kept her at arm's length. For the first time, I felt an unshakable sense of suffocation. I tried to talk to her, explaining that I needed some time with my friends and family too, and that it didn't mean I cared about her any less. But she just looked at me with this hurt, wounded expression that twisted my insides. The conversation escalated, with her telling me that I was selfish and too independent to really be in a relationship. That night, I realized that this wasn't something I could fix by offering more of myself. She was demanding all of me, and there wasn't any room left for me to just be myself. The breakup was messy. She told me I'd betrayed her, that I'd led her on. She said things that were sharp and cruel, words I'll probably carry with me for a long time. Part of me wanted to go back and comfort her, to make it all better, but a larger part of me knew that I'd just end up sinking back into that isolation. Now I find myself second-guessing every green flag I thought I'd seen at the start. Was she really supportive and attentive, or was it just her way of getting closer and finding ways to bind me to her? It makes me wonder, how can you tell when a green flag is real and when it's just the beginning of something more dangerous? In Reddit, how do you know when you're mistaking intensity for genuine care? I met this woman through a friend, and she seemed like a breath of fresh air. Our first phone call had been hilarious, full of sarcasm and dark humor, which I loved. She seemed smart, grounded, and honest. Qualities you don't find often these days. When she suggested we meet up for a hike, I was a little surprised, but it felt spontaneous and exciting. I'm not a huge outdoorsy guy, but I figured why not. She showed up at the trailhead in full hiking gear, like something out of a magazine. The hat, the high-tech water bottle, even those serious-looking hiking boots that probably cost more than my whole outfit. I rolled up in my casual sneakers and hoodie, feeling a little underprepared, but she didn't seem to mind. In fact, she complimented my relaxed style. Things were going well, for about 5 minutes. Then she pulled out a GoPro. She said she wanted to document the hike for her channel. I thought it was a bit weird to record a first date, but I didn't say anything, just try to go along with it. As we started walking, she kept talking to the camera instead of me, narrating everything like we were on some nature documentary. When I tried to say something, she'd shush me with a finger and turn to the camera, adding her own thoughts, while I awkwardly shuffled along beside her, trying to look like I was part of the experience instead of a background extra. About halfway up the trail, she decided we needed to do a sit-down interview segment. She pointed the camera at me and said, "So, tell the viewers what you're thinking right now." I tried to laugh it off and said, "Honestly, I'm wondering if you'll let me buy you lunch after this." She just gave me a funny look, like I'd totally missed the point, and said, "Let's keep it on topic. What do you think of nature's power?" I stumbled through a few words about peace and the beauty of it all, while she nodded, intensely focused on my every word, until she turned back to the camera and added her own deeper reflections. We finally reached the top, where I thought we'd get a break from filming, maybe have a real conversation. Instead, she pulled out a mini tripod and set up her phone to record us, reflecting on the journey. She'd ask me questions like, "What did you discover about yourself on this hike?" I'd try to answer honestly, but she'd interrupt with her own profound thoughts, like she was on a spiritual journey and I was just tagging along. The entire date felt like an audition, like I was a guest star on her live show. By the time we got back down to the parking lot, I felt exhausted, emotionally drained, and a little like I'd been on a one-man reality show I hadn't signed up for. She asked if I'd be willing to come hiking with her again sometime. I smiled and nodded, but knew I'd never pick up the phone. That was the day I realized I wasn't dating her. I was just a prop in her life, another episode in her ongoing series. Another time, I went out with this woman who seemed like the sweetest, most genuine person online. She was kind, thoughtful, and didn't seem interested in any of the usual superficial stuff. We decided to meet at a quiet coffee shop, and I was genuinely looking forward to it. She showed up, smiled warmly, and we started talking about everything from our favorite books to our families. It felt like I was talking to someone I'd known for years. She had this open, inviting energy that made me feel comfortable, like I could tell her anything. But then, out of nowhere, she started talking about how the world was ending. At first, I thought she was joking, but she leaned in, her eyes wide, and started explaining how she'd been following this group that believed society was on the brink of collapse. She talked about how the government was hiding secrets about aliens, even about how technology was all part of a grand scheme to control our minds. She said she'd joined a survivalist community and started learning how to forage for food and build shelter. I tried to play along, smiling and nodding, hoping she'd shift back to regular topics. But she just kept going, asking me if I'd thought about preparing for the inevitable, and if I was willing to join her in protecting the future. She leaned in closer, a serious look in her eyes, and asked if I was ready to say goodbye to everything I'd known and start a new life off the grid. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to make a joke, but she seemed so passionate and so certain that I didn't want to offend her. I mumbled something about needing time to think it over, and she nodded, as if this was a totally normal first date topic. She left with a smile, saying she'd send me some important links to review. I did get those links, and I didn't click on any of them. I just couldn't bring myself to go on a second date with someone who saw me as a partner for the apocalypse rather than someone to grab coffee with. The whole experience left me wondering what kind of world we're living in where dating can turn into a recruitment pitch for a doomsday scenario. And then there was the girl who said she didn't believe in dating apps, that she was more traditional. I like that about her. It seemed refreshing. We met through mutual friends, and our first date was at this little jazz bar she'd suggested. It was dark, cozy, and intimate, with just enough ambient noise to make the conversation feel private. She showed up looking stunning, and we immediately hit it off. She asked me a lot of questions about myself, what I did for work, my hobbies, how I spent my weekends. It felt good to be with someone who seemed genuinely interested in me. About an hour in, though, things took a weird turn. She looked me in the eye and asked, "So, how much do you make a year?" I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't blink. I mumbled a vague answer, but she wasn't having it. She started pressing, asking about my job benefits, if I had any debt, if I owned property. I tried to keep things light, saying I was still building my life up, and she nodded with this unreadable expression. Then, out of nowhere, she mentioned she was looking for a provider, someone who could give her a stable future and a good life. She laid out her non-negotiables as if we were signing a contract. Things like yearly vacations, a house with a garden, and a healthy retirement plan. The date turned into a financial interview. She even had a list on her phone of qualities she expected in a partner. Reading aloud while I sat there, nodding politely, my brain racing to figure out how to escape without being rude. She ended the night with, "I'll be evaluating if you meet my standards, but I like what I see so far." I walked out of that jazz bar feeling like I'd just been sized up like a piece of real estate. It left me realizing that some people aren't looking for a partner. They're looking for a lifestyle sponsor. After that, I stopped putting so much pressure on myself to impress anyone. I figured if dating was just going to be this minefield of weird expectations and hidden agendas, I'd rather be alone than keep feeling like an accessory in someone else's plan. When it happened, it felt surreal. I was standing there, brushing my teeth in the half-light of our tiny bathroom, when she walked in, looked at me, and said, "I think I want a divorce." Just like that, casual, as if she were asking if I wanted coffee. I remember gripping the sink so hard my knuckles went white, trying to ground myself in the face of something that suddenly felt too real to ignore. I asked her why. I tried to stay calm, to keep my voice even, and she looked at me with an exhaustion that ran deeper than I'd ever noticed. Eyes a little glossy with tears she wasn't going to let fall. I don't feel like I'm in love anymore," she said. And then she whispered, almost as if it was a confession, "And I don't know if I have been for a long time." That was the beginning of the end, but if I'm honest, I think it had been coming for years. I met her back in college. She was this whirlwind of laughter and endless ideas, always talking about dreams she'd someday chase. We were young and naive, and when we met, there was this spark. She wore this faded jean jacket with little pins she collected from thrift stores and concerts, and I loved how unapologetically herself she was. We spent entire nights talking about everything and nothing, lying on a blanket in the park or squeezed into crowded coffee shops, imagining lives that stretched on forever. She used to tease me about how I'd get quiet whenever she laughed too loudly in public, a sound that could turn heads but always felt like music to me. But somewhere between moving into our first apartment and climbing the ladders of adulthood, things started changing. The funny thing about love is that it doesn't die in some big, dramatic way. It erodes. Little by little, everyday things started chipping away at what we had. We got wrapped up in our jobs, our responsibilities. Conversations got shorter. Date nights became fewer. We both kept saying, "Next week, let's make more time," but next week never came. I knew something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to face it. We both tried. When we hit our first big roadblock a few years in, I suggested a couple's retreat. She agreed, and we drove 6 hours to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. We spent 2 days talking through things, writing down lists of what we loved about each other, trying to rekindle some spark. For a while, it even felt like it worked. There were moments when I'd catch her looking at me with that old, familiar warmth, moments when we'd laugh the way we used to. But it never seemed to stick. We'd come home, fall back into our routines, and somehow everything would fade back into silence. One night, I tried a grand gesture, something to show her that I still cared, that I hadn't given up. I bought tickets to a concert for her favorite band, booked a hotel, planned a night out just like old times. For a few hours, it felt like we'd slipped back to when things were good. She leaned against me, eyes closed, swaying to the music, and I could almost believe we were okay. But when we got back to the hotel, she rolled over, turning her back to me in bed, and I knew. She was there, but she was a million miles away. Looking back, maybe I was just afraid to see the truth, afraid of what would happen if I acknowledged that our love had become fragile, something that could break with a single wrong word. So, we drifted. We argued over little things. Whether I worked too much, why she spent more time with her friends than with me, why our conversations always turned so stilted and tense. After she asked for the divorce, I spent days swinging between denial and this deep, hollow grief. It wasn't just the end of our marriage. It felt like losing a part of myself, the part that had dared to hope for a life together. I kept thinking about what I could have done differently, replaying moments, looking for missed signs. Every little argument felt like a clue I should have seen, and every time we'd failed to connect felt like a weight I couldn't shake. The hardest part was the silence that followed. She moved out quickly, leaving our place with boxes full of clothes, books, memories we'd once shared. And suddenly, the apartment was too big, every corner echoing with memories. The first few weeks after she left, I'd come home to our empty place and feel this crushing weight of solitude. The emptiness was so loud it was almost unbearable. I found myself avoiding the living room, where we used to binge our favorite shows on Friday nights. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text her about something funny that happened at work, only to remember she wasn't there to share it with me anymore. Friends tried to check in, but most of the time, I'd brush them off pretending I was fine when I was anything, but eventually, I knew I had to do something before I lost myself completely to this darkness. I started going to a support group, which felt strange at first. I remember sitting in a circle, listening to others talk about their breakups, realizing just how many people were walking around with broken hearts. For the first time, I didn't feel quite so alone. And it was there that I finally allowed myself to grieve out loud, to admit how much I'd lost, how much I missed her, and how afraid I was that I'd never be able to move on. Slowly, I began to piece together a life without her. I took up jogging, something I'd never had the time for before, and I'd spend mornings running through the neighborhood, letting the rhythm of my feet on the pavement ground me. I started reading again, diving into books that she'd never had the patience for, letting myself discover interests that had always taken a back seat. Friends pulled me out for drinks and dinners, and over time, I began to let myself laugh again, to enjoy moments that weren't haunted by what I'd lost. Still, there are nights when I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ghost of her beside me. I'll see something she would have loved, hear a song that we used to play on repeat, and I'm back in the past, back in the warmth of who we used to be. There's a part of me that will always carry that. I think you can't love someone for so long and just erase them. But I'm learning to move forward. I don't know if I'll ever fully get over it, or if I'll find someone who can make me feel the way she did. But I do know that I'm finding myself again, day by day, bit by bit. So, for anyone who's gone through this, how did you cope? How did you find the strength to finally let go and start fresh? Because some days, even now, I still feel like I'm barely holding on. Sleeping with my best friend was the most natural, surreal, and confusing thing that ever happened to me. We'd been inseparable for years, the kind of best friends who knew each other's embarrassing stories, every bad date, and could finish each other's sentences. But there was always this lingering, unacknowledged tension between us, like a small electric current that we both felt but were too scared to talk about. Then one night, after a terrible week at work, he showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine, my favorite takeout, and a movie. He had this way of knowing exactly when I needed a pick-me-up, and that night, it was like he'd planned everything perfectly. We ate, laughed, vented about life, and I was finally starting to feel better. But then, as we were watching the movie, he reached over and took my hand without saying a word. It was the smallest gesture, but in that moment, I felt everything shift between us. I looked over at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my best friend. I saw him. Just him. Someone who knew me better than anyone else ever had. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were kissing, and then, well, the rest is a bit of a blur. I remember thinking, is this actually happening? It felt almost dreamlike, like we'd been holding back something so powerful that it had to break free sooner or later. That night, every unspoken feeling came rushing out, and it was so intense I could barely process it. But when I woke up the next morning, reality hit me like a cold shower. We didn't talk about what had happened. We just went back to our usual routine. It was like we both silently agreed to pretend that nothing had changed. And for a while, it kind of worked. We'd meet up, go out with friends, and act as if that night had just been an anomaly, a glitch in the universe that we didn't need to acknowledge. But inside, I felt different. Every time he smiled at me, every time he laughed at my jokes, I felt this pang in my chest, like I'd crossed a line I could never come back from. Things came to a head a few months later. He started seeing someone, a girl he met through work. She was sweet, funny, and I could tell he was into her. And it killed me. But what hurt the most was how he kept treating me like nothing was wrong. He'd still text me every day, still show up to our usual hangouts, acting like he wasn't tearing my heart apart just by being there. I wanted to tell him, to scream, "Why can't you see me?" But I couldn't. I'd let myself get trapped in this silent role. The best friend who'd be there for him no matter what, even as I was dying inside. Then one night, after another group outing where I'd watched him flirt with her all night, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked him if he could come over to talk. When he walked in, he knew something was up. I tried to keep it casual, tried to act like I wasn't on the verge of a breakdown, but the words just spilled out. I told him that I couldn't keep pretending anymore, that I'd fallen for him that night. And every day, since had been a constant reminder of how much I wanted him. I told him I couldn't keep being just friends with him if he couldn't see me the way I saw him. He looked stunned, like he hadn't even considered that this was what I'd been feeling. He didn't say anything for a while, just looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. Finally, he said he hadn't realized how much that night had meant to me, that he thought we were both just caught up in the moment. He said he'd always cared about me deeply, but he wasn't sure he could give me the kind of relationship I wanted. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. I'd been holding on to this small sliver of hope, convincing myself that he felt the same way, that he was just too scared to admit it. But in that moment, I knew that he didn't. Or maybe he did, but he wasn't willing to let go of whatever wall he'd built around his feelings for me. It hurt, but it was also this strange relief, like I could finally let go of the fantasy I'd been holding on to. We ended up in this weird limbo where we'd talk occasionally, but not like before. The closeness we once had was gone, replaced by this cautious, polite distance. He's still in my life, but it's different now, like we're old friends who've drifted apart. I sometimes wonder if things could have turned out differently if I'd kept my feelings to myself. But then I remind myself that this was the only way I could move on. Now, every time I see him post on social media, I feel this bittersweet pang. Part of me will always love him, but I know that I did the right thing. At least now I can look back on that night without wondering what could have been, because I already know. And maybe, in a way, that's a kind of closure. I'll just come out and say it. I'm afraid my relationship might be falling apart, and I don't know what to do about it. It's like I woke up one day and everything felt different. Off. It didn't happen all at once. More like a slow, creeping feeling that started one evening a few weeks ago. We'd had this little ritual on Friday nights where we'd order takeout and pick out a movie together, just unwinding after the week. It wasn't anything fancy, just our little way to relax and be close. But that night, instead of sitting beside me on the couch, he'd stayed at the dining table, tapping away on his laptop. I didn't think too much of it. He'd been busy with work lately, so I figured he had a deadline or something. But as the night went on, he barely looked up. The movie ended. I took our dishes to the sink, and he was still typing away, lost in his own world. I could feel this pit in my stomach, this sudden fear that our connection had somehow slipped into the background for him. The part that really throws me off, though, is how he's been ever since. It's like he's there, but he's not there. If that makes sense. He still goes through all the motions. He's polite, kind, says I love you before bed, but there's this strange distance that I can't shake. Sometimes he'll do something so thoughtful it almost brings me to tears. Like last week, he knew I was having a rough day, so he brought home these lavender bath salts I mentioned wanting a while ago. He handed them to me with this soft look, and for a moment, I felt like we were right back to where we started. But then he'll go back to being distant again, like that tender moment never even happened. The other night, I was looking at him across the room, trying to find that same spark, the connection that used to be there. He'd always been the first one to reach out, pulling me into his orbit, and I would just sink into it like I belonged there. But now, he doesn't even seem to notice when I'm looking at him, like he's wrapped up in his own private world. And I can't help but feel this emptiness growing in me, like I'm slowly becoming invisible to him. I keep trying to tell myself it's just a rough patch, that every relationship has its lulls, its ups and downs. I replay memories in my head, the silly early morning texts, the late night car rides where we'd listen to our favorite songs on loop, or that time we stayed up way too late talking about everything and nothing at all. It felt like there was this energy between us, like we were the only two people in the world who understood each other. But now I feel like I'm grasping at straws, wondering if he's still even in this with me, or if he's already halfway out the door. Last weekend, I decided to take a shot at breaking through this wall between us. We were supposed to have lunch together, but he was late. He'd texted to say he'd be there soon, but then he was on his phone the whole time, responding in quick, distracted sentences, barely making eye contact. I felt this overwhelming frustration, and before I could even stop myself, the words came spilling out. "What's going on with us?" I asked, my voice breaking a little. "You're here, but you're not here. Did I do something?" He looked at me, startled like I just caught him off guard. For a second, I saw something flicker in his expression, maybe guilt or sadness, or something else I couldn't quite place. But then he just sighed and rubbed his temples, saying, "It's not you. I don't know, I think I need some space to figure things out." That was it. I think I need some space. No explanation, no reassurance. Just those words that left me feeling like I was standing on thin ice, waiting for it to crack beneath me. I wanted to scream, to ask him why, or what I could do, or if there was something I wasn't seeing. But instead, I nodded, not wanting to push him further away, even though it felt like my heart was breaking right there. And now, I'm left replaying that conversation over and over, feeling like I'm somehow both part of this relationship and a bystander, watching from the outside. I keep wondering if this is just a phase, something we'll work through together, or if he's already checked out and I'm just the last one to figure it out. How do you even know if your partner is still in it with you, or if they're just too kind to leave? I don't know how to let go if that's what I'm supposed to do. I keep hoping he'll come back to me, that whatever he's going through will pass and he'll look at me the way he used to. But then, sometimes I feel like I'm clinging to memories more than to him, and I don't know what to do with that. So here I am, reaching out to strangers, hoping someone can help me make sense of this. How do you know when a relationship is just in a rough patch versus when it's really over? Is there a way to figure it out without pushing him away? If anyone's been through something like this, please let me know. It started as just a regular night out, one of those spontaneous evenings when you tell yourself you're just going to grab a drink and see what happens. I'd been out with my friends, a little too eager to unwind after a crazy week, and the bar was packed with the usual mix of energy, laughter, and the kind of buzz you only find on a Friday night. Somewhere between a bad joke from one of my friends and the second drink, I noticed him. He stood at the edge of the crowd, tall, relaxed, like he was completely comfortable with himself, which is rare to see these days. We exchanged glances a few times, nothing too dramatic, just that slow, magnetic pull that happens when two people notice each other without saying a word. I don't know why, but something about him instantly felt different, like he wasn't just part of the scene. When he finally approached, it was like we both knew it was inevitable, just a matter of when. His first words made me laugh, and suddenly, the conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we'd known each other for ages. We talked, we danced, and time seemed to slip away. As the night went on, things got more intense. He pulled me closer, and before I knew it, we were outside, caught up in the kind of kiss that makes you forget where you are. It felt reckless but exhilarating, And for the first time in a long while, I was completely in the moment. It's like I'd forgotten all my worries and just let myself feel. We ended up at his place, both of us barely aware of the world around us as we gave into the intensity of the night. It was one of those rare moments where it feels like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. But the morning was a different story. When I opened my eyes and saw him lying beside me, reality set in, and the thrill of the night before was replaced by a mix of emotions I hadn't anticipated. I sat there for a moment, just looking at him, and I realized something strange. I wasn't regretting it exactly, but I felt a kind of emptiness that I couldn't quite place. All those little fleeting moments that had felt so full of promise the night before now seemed like echoes, leaving me feeling surprisingly alone. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, gathered my things, and let myself out, careful not to wake him. I had expected to feel empowered, maybe even liberated, but instead, I found myself wondering if this was really what I wanted. Walking home in the early morning light, I felt the weight of the night's excitement slowly lifting, leaving a sort of quiet emptiness in its place. It was like waking up from a vivid dream that had felt so real, only to find myself back in my own reality, unchanged and oddly unsatisfied. Later that day, I kept replaying everything in my head, thinking about all the times I'd thrown myself into these wild, one-off connections, hoping they'd fill some space inside me. I had always enjoyed the excitement, the rush, but now, in the quiet of my own apartment, I was starting to wonder if I'd been looking for something deeper all along without even realizing it. It was like I'd been searching for a spark to ignite something real, but had only ended up with these brief, empty flares that faded as quickly as they began. I spent the rest of that week reflecting on the past, on all the spontaneous nights, the flings, the moments I'd chased without thinking twice. The truth is, I've always prided myself on being free-spirited, on enjoying life without strings or expectations. But suddenly, it didn't feel like freedom anymore. It felt more like avoidance. Was I running from something? Or maybe running towards something that I hadn't found yet? I ended up reaching out to a friend, someone who'd been through her own roller coaster of casual relationships, hoping she'd understand. She listened, nodding thoughtfully, and then she said something that hit me harder than I expected. Casual is fun until it stops feeling casual, she said. Then it's just a reminder that something's missing. Those words stuck with me. Maybe I'd been searching for more than I was willing to admit. Since then, I've been rethinking everything. I'm still open to adventure, still love a good night out, but I'm not sure if I can keep pretending that these fleeting encounters are enough for me. I want something more than just the rush of the night, more than the thrill that vanishes by morning. I'm not saying I'm done with fun, but I'm ready to be honest with myself about what I really want. For the first time, I'm realizing that maybe I've outgrown the thrill of casual and am ready for something real, something that lasts beyond the morning light. That night wasn't just another hookup. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that life is about more than these brief, wild moments. I used to think casual encounters were freeing, a way to enjoy life without complications. But now, I see that true freedom comes from knowing what you want and not settling for anything less. The whole thing started with a joke. It was one of those half-serious, half-joking comments that usually get a laugh or a playful jab. But this time it backfired. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, just scrolling through our phones, and I casually said, "If you wanted to pick up a hobby, I bet you'd be great at reorganizing everything we own." I smirked, expecting her to laugh and say something sarcastic back, like she usually does. Instead, she froze and looked at me with this blank stare, and suddenly I knew I'd touched a nerve. She put her phone down and sighed. "So, you think I'm controlling?" she asked quietly, not meeting my eyes. I tried to laugh it off. No, not like that. I just meant you have this amazing eye for detail. You're super organized." I smiled, trying to pull her back to our usual easy banter. But she wasn't smiling back. She just looked away and said, "I get it. I know I can be too much sometimes." Something in her tone unsettled me, but I told myself it was nothing. After all, it was just a joke, right? A misunderstanding we could laugh about later. But I was wrong. That one offhand comment somehow cracked open a deeper layer in our relationship, and I felt it widening over the next few weeks. every time we tried to talk about anything serious. We'd been together for 3 years, and while we've had disagreements, we'd never had real problems communicating before, or so I thought. But after that night, I started noticing this weird pattern. Every time I tried to bring up something on my mind, like if I'd had a rough day at work or felt a little stressed about something, it was like she was barely listening, almost impatient for me to finish. I'd mention a work issue, and she'd immediately jump in with, "Oh, that reminds me," and completely steer the conversation into her day or her stress. Or we'd be talking about our weekend plans, and I'd suggest something low-key, maybe just a hike or a lazy morning at home. But she'd act like she hadn't heard and suggest a busy brunch with her friends or a full day of errands, like it didn't even matter what I'd said. I started feeling like a bystander in my own relationship, as if I were just there to fill up space but didn't actually have a voice. Every time I tried to bring it up, she'd brush it off as me being too sensitive or say, "We don't have to overanalyze everything." I told myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling only grew. A lot of little things started getting under my skin. How she'd always make plans without asking if I was interested, how she'd change the subject whenever I started talking about something that mattered to me, or how she'd react with this weird defensiveness anytime I mentioned even the slightest problem. It got to the point where I felt like I was talking to a wall, like everything I said was just bouncing back with no real impact. Finally, I decided to confront it head on. One evening, after another round of feeling brushed off, I just told her, "Listen, I feel like I'm not really being heard anymore. I feel like every time I try to talk, you tune out or just shift the topic. It's like my feelings don't really matter." I try to keep my tone calm, even though my heart was pounding. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. "So now I'm the bad guy? You think I'm this terrible girlfriend who doesn't care?" "No, that's not it," I said, already feeling the familiar frustration bubble up. "I'm just trying to tell you how I feel. I want us to be able to talk about these things." She crossed her arms and looked away, muttering, "It's just like you to make everything into a problem." At that moment, I felt this wave of helplessness. Here I was trying to open up, trying to be vulnerable, and she was shutting me down, turning it back on me. Every word I said seemed to trigger her more, until the whole conversation spiraled into an argument about how I was always criticizing her. It wasn't true, and I think on some level she knew that. But there we were, stuck in this cycle of defensiveness and hurt with no way out. After that night, things got even worse. Conversations became exhausting. Even simple topics felt like they were charged with unspoken resentment. It's like we both knew there were bigger issues under the surface, but neither of us wanted to admit it. I'd come home from work and feel this constant tension, this invisible wall between us. Sometimes I try to just let it go, to push down my feelings and pretend everything was fine. But it didn't work. The longer I bottled it up, the more I felt like I was suffocating. I started questioning everything. Why did I feel so alone when I was with the person I loved? Why did every conversation leave me feeling drained and misunderstood? Was I asking too much for wanting her to just listen? I felt guilty, like maybe I was being unreasonable, like I was creating problems where there didn't need to be any. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that feeling of loneliness just kept growing. Eventually, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I decided we needed to have one last, honest conversation, where I'd lay everything out and try to get through to her without any walls or defenses. I wanted to tell her how much this was affecting me, how much I wanted to feel seen and understood, and that I couldn't keep feeling like I was in a relationship with someone who wasn't really there. So, one evening, I sat her down and told her I needed to talk. I poured out everything I'd been feeling, laying it all on the line, hoping she'd finally see how much this was hurting me. I told her how it felt to be dismissed, to have my feelings ignored, to feel like I was constantly talking to someone who'd already decided my thoughts didn't matter. But instead of the understanding and connection I'd hoped for, her reaction was like a punch to the gut. She got defensive, telling me I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive, and that I just needed to let things go. She went on to say that I was always finding things to be unhappy about, and that maybe I was the one with the issue, not her. At that moment, I felt this overwhelming sadness, this crushing realization that maybe we were on completely different pages. I'd opened myself up, shown her my vulnerability, and all I got in return was blame and dismissal. I felt like I'd been carrying this huge weight, and instead of offering to help me lift it, she just added more. Now, I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to keep trying, to believe that maybe, eventually, she'll see how much this matters to me. But another part of me feels like I'm banging my head against a wall, trying to communicate with someone who's just not willing to meet me halfway. I love her, but I'm starting to wonder if love is enough to bridge this gap, or if we're just too different to ever really understand each other. Has anyone else gone through something like this? Is there a way to get through to someone who just doesn't seem to want to listen? Or am I just fooling myself, hoping that this is something we can fix? Ethan and I have been together for 2 years, and from the beginning, it was like something out of a movie. We met at a friend's wedding, and he made me laugh so hard that night that my face hurt for days. Our relationship has been easy, natural, like finding the perfect rhythm in a song. He was caring and attentive, someone who would pick up my favorite dessert just because he knew I'd had a rough day or call me during lunch breaks to check in. I felt lucky, like I'd finally found someone who just got me. We talked about our dreams, our fears, everything. We talked about the future too, even had an informal list of places we wanted to travel, things we wanted to do together. It felt solid, like something I could count on. But then a few months ago, things started to shift. At first, I chalked it up to work stress. Ethan had just started a new project that demanded long hours, and I tried to be understanding. But his texts became shorter and less frequent. He'd cancel plans last minute, saying he was too exhausted or just wanted a night in. And on the nights we did spend together, he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere, like he was only half listening to me. There were times I'd tell him a story and he'd blink, like he hadn't caught a single word I'd said. The real kicker, though, was his phone. It sounds petty, but I noticed he started keeping it face down on the table. Anytime it buzzed, he'd give this little glance, then shove it into his pocket like it was some guilty secret. He never used to be secretive about his phone. He'd always show me memes, photos, funny texts from his family, but now it was like this little piece of his life I wasn't allowed to touch. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe I just never noticed it before. But the more I watched, the more suspicious I felt. The changes weren't just subtle anymore. He'd once been this open book with me, so in tune with my emotions that he could practically finish my sentences. But now it felt like he was guarded, almost cold. We'd go entire evenings barely speaking, and when I tried to ask if everything was okay, he'd brush it off with, "I'm just stressed," or "Work's been crazy lately." I wanted to believe him. I really did. I told myself everyone goes through phases where they're more focused on themselves or need a little space. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing him, little by little. I found myself questioning everything. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, running through all our recent interactions, wondering if I was overanalyzing, being needy, or if there was really something deeper going on. It was exhausting, this constant loop of doubt and guilt. I didn't want to be the kind of person who couldn't trust her partner, but his sudden change in behavior made it feel like I had no choice but to question. Finally, one night, after he'd canceled plans with me for the 3rd time that week, I decided I couldn't just sit in silence anymore. I had to know if he was really in this with me, or if I was just fooling myself. I invited him over, and when he showed up, he looked so tired, but something about his exhaustion seemed deeper, almost as if he were carrying some invisible weight. We sat on the couch, the air thick with tension. I felt my throat go dry, but I knew I couldn't keep holding it all in. "Ethan," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is everything okay? With us? I mean..." He looked taken aback, his eyes flickering to the side, as though searching for an escape. "What do you mean?" he asked, feigning innocence, though he knew exactly what I meant. "I feel like you've been pulling away," I said, forcing myself to keep going, despite the growing tightness in my chest. "You're here, but you're not. You cancel on me, you barely text, and when you're around, it feels like you're somewhere else." He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just work. I've told you, it's been intense lately." "I get that, Ethan, but even when you're not working, you're not really here with me. I feel like I don't even know what's going on in your life anymore." There was a silence that stretched out between us, one so thick and uncomfortable that I could practically hear my heart pounding. I wanted him to say something, anything, that would explain the distance between us. But he just sat there, staring at his hands, as if he didn't have the words, or maybe the courage, to tell me what was really going on. "Is there someone else?" I asked, barely able to say it. The words sounded foreign, heavy, as though they didn't belong to me. It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I'd been too afraid to ask, but I couldn't keep it inside anymore. He looked up sharply, his eyes widening. "What? No, it's not that," he said almost too quickly, as if the idea hadn't even crossed his mind. But something in his tone didn't feel right, and the reassurance I hoped for never came. "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why does it feel like I'm losing you?" He sighed deeply, running his hands through his hair in frustration. I don't know what to tell you. I'm just dealing with a lot right now, okay? It's not about you." The words hit me like a slap. "Not about me?" I repeated, barely able to keep the frustration out of my voice. "How can it not be about me when we're in this together? How can you just shut me out and act like I wouldn't notice?" He didn't have an answer, or maybe he just didn't want to give one. He mumbled something about needing space and figuring things out on his own, but it felt like an excuse, a flimsy explanation meant to appease me without really addressing the problem. I sat there, watching him retreat further and further, and a hollow feeling settled in my chest. The person I loved, the person I thought I knew so well, was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. After he left that night, I sat on the couch for hours, replaying everything in my mind. I wanted to believe that he was telling the truth, that maybe it really was just stress, and that things would go back to normal once his workload lightened up. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play, something he wasn't telling me. The uncertainty gnawed at me, filling every quiet moment with doubt. I found myself scrolling through old photos of us, looking at the smiles we used to share, the joy that used to come so easily. How had we gone from that to this? How could everything feel so wrong so suddenly? Now, I'm left with questions I don't have answers to, unsure of what the future holds for us. I want to believe that we can get through this, that maybe he just needs time and space to sort things out. But another part of me wonders if I'm just holding on to something that's already slipping away, something I can't fix on my own. Is it possible to save a relationship when you don't even know what's broken? Has anyone been through something like this and come out stronger on the other side? Because right now, I feel like I'm lost, desperately searching for a way to bring him back to me. I always thought I'd know when a relationship was going wrong. I'd see the signs, recognize the red flags, and protect myself. But falling for Alec taught me how easily someone could slip past my defenses. It didn't happen all at once. It was like drifting in a slow current until I was so far out I could barely see the shore. I keep thinking back, wondering if there was a moment I should have run. The first night we met, maybe. It was a warm Saturday night in early summer, and I was out with friends, laughing and dancing like we hadn't a care in the world. Alec walked up to me with this easy confidence, and we spent hours talking like we'd known each other forever. By the end of the night, my friends were teasing me about the guy from the bar who was clearly smitten. And they were right. Alec was completely taken with me. He texted good morning, called just to hear my voice, made time for me in ways that no one else ever had. I remember my heart racing every time I saw his name pop up on my screen. In those first weeks, Alec seemed almost too good to be true. He was attentive, always ready to support my ideas, laughing at my worst jokes, and saying things that made me feel beautiful, special. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about what I said or how I looked. He wanted me just as I was. He was always there, listening to me vent after a tough day, holding me close when I felt down. He remembered little details, surprising me with my favorite things, and planning these incredible dates I never thought anyone would put so much effort into. My friends told me how lucky I was, and I started to believe it too. Then came the first small crack. Alec noticed a friend of mine, Ben, in one of my Instagram photos and asked, "How long have you known him?" His tone was light, like he was just making conversation, but something in his eyes made me hesitate. When I told him Ben and I were close friends, Alec's jaw tightened just for a moment before he shrugged it off, saying, "I just think you need to be careful with guys like that. Sometimes friends don't stay just friends." I laughed it off, said he had nothing to worry about, but he kept bringing it up in small, subtle ways. He'd joke about how Ben must have a thing for me, or would throw out an offhand comment about how he didn't believe men and women could really be just friends. I brushed it off, thought it was cute that he cared, that maybe he just wasn't used to having close friendships that were strictly platonic. And I let it slide. It seemed harmless. But soon, these little jokes started piling up. He began questioning where I was, who I was with, making comments that stayed with me long after he'd left. "It's just weird that you always go out without me," he'd say. "I mean, don't you want me there?" And while his words were casual, they came with this quiet pressure, making me feel guilty for wanting time with my friends. I started turning down invitations, preferring to stay in with Alec just to avoid any tension. The sad thing is, I didn't even realize what was happening. I thought I was being considerate. Over time, it became harder to see where his care ended and his control began. One day, I was getting ready to meet a friend I hadn't seen in a while, a girl I'd known since high school. As I got dressed, Alec made a comment. "That skirt's a little short, isn't it? You know I'm just looking out for you. I don't want other guys to get the wrong idea." I shrugged it off, laughed even, thinking he was being protective. But the longer I looked at myself in the mirror, the more self-conscious I felt. Eventually, I changed into jeans, telling myself I just wanted to feel more comfortable. It kept going like that, little shifts in my choices, my decisions, my priorities. Without realizing it, I'd started to let Alec define the boundaries of my world. If I wanted to see friends, I'd check with him first. If I had a new idea or wanted to try something different, I ran it by him, waiting for his approval. He was there, always, his presence like an invisible thread wrapping around every part of my life. I didn't notice how isolated I was becoming until my best friend, Sarah, called me one day. She sounded hesitant, even nervous. "Hey, are you okay? I feel like I never see you anymore." I immediately went on the defensive, reassuring her, saying Alec was just really busy, and that's why we've been spending so much time alone together. But her voice was careful, probing, and she asked, "Are you sure? I mean, I miss you, but it just feels like, I don't know, like you're not yourself lately." That was the first time I felt this pang of doubt. I remember hanging up and feeling this tight knot in my stomach. I went to Alec and told him what she'd said, expecting him to laugh it off or reassure me. Instead, he got this cold look, shrugged, and said, "She's probably just jealous because she doesn't have someone like I do. You know, some friends don't want to see you happy." And in that moment, he shifted the blame, twisted it just enough to make me question my own friend. Months passed, and my world kept shrinking, one compromise at a time. Alec would comment on the clothes I wore, the people I texted, even the way I spoke, with this gentle criticism masked as concern. He'd say things like, "I just want you to be the best version of yourself," or "It's only because I care about you." It became exhausting, always trying to meet his standards, always feeling like I wasn't quite enough. But he was there to fix me, to mold me, to make me better, and I clung to that. Then, one night, we had a fight that pushed me over the edge. It started over something small. I didn't reply to his text right away because I was in the middle of a work meeting. When I got out, I saw 3 missed calls and a series of messages, each more demanding than the last. I tried to explain, but he blew up, saying, "I don't understand why it's so hard for you to just be there for me. Are you even serious about us?" His voice was loud, hurtful, full of anger, and I just stood there numb. After he left, I sat in silence, replaying every moment, every compromise, every change I'd made to keep him happy. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd lost myself. I was a shell of who I used to be, always second-guessing, always trying to appease, always fearing that next confrontation. Now I'm here, unsure of what to do, writing this out and hoping someone will understand. Part of me wonders if I'm just overreacting, if this is what real relationships are supposed to be, full of compromise and constant effort. But then another part of me is screaming, asking why I should feel so small, so unworthy in the arms of someone who's supposed to love me. So I'm asking you, the strangers of the internet, when did you realize enough was enough? How did you find the strength to walk away when everything you had was tied up in someone else's version of love? The first time I met Daniel, I wasn't sure he was even my type. He had this unassuming presence, quiet but attentive, and he wasn't anything like the usual kind of guy who'd catch my eye. But there was something about the way he listened, how he seemed genuinely interested in everything I said, no matter how small. When he remembered the exact details of the story I'd told him, how I'd lost my favorite necklace in the ocean as a kid, I thought, all right, maybe there's something here. On our second date, he surprised me with a small pendant. Nothing fancy, just something he'd picked up at a flea market. "For the necklace you lost," he'd said with a shy smile. I felt this little spark of warmth, something I hadn't felt in a long time. His thoughtfulness was so refreshing. Green flag number one, I thought, someone who listens and cares about the small stuff. Pretty soon, I noticed how he had this uncanny ability to inspire me in ways I hadn't expected. I was always a little self-conscious about my love for painting. For years, I'd sketched and dabbled, but it was something I kept private, like a secret passion I was almost embarrassed about. Daniel was different. He not only encouraged me to paint, but he also cleared out a space in his garage and built a little studio for me. He spent his weekends helping me pick out brushes and canvases, driving with me to artsy neighborhoods to visit galleries. Being with him made me feel free to try things I'd never let myself believe I could. But as time went on, little things began to stick out in odd ways. He would occasionally make jokes that left me feeling off balance, but they were subtle enough that I'd let them slide. Once, when I told him I'd sold one of my paintings at a small art show, he just looked at me, gave a quick "that's nice," and changed the subject. When I tried to show him the painting later, he shrugged and said, "I don't really get modern art." It wasn't mean, but it felt like a dismissal of something important to me. I tried to laugh it off, thinking he was just being blunt, but a small part of me couldn't shake the disappointment. He also had this habit of subtly questioning things I did. If I was going out with friends, he'd ask for all the details: who was going, where we'd be, and what time I'd be back. At first, I saw it as protectiveness, something I actually found kind of sweet. I'd even text him when I got home, thinking it was my way of letting him know he was on my mind. And yet, sometimes he'd make a side comment that caught me off guard. Like if I posted a picture with friends, he'd say, "Wow, didn't think you were the posting every moment type." Or he'd see a comment from a guy friend on one of my photos and give a lighthearted "that guy again." It was always in this semi-joking tone, as if he was teasing, but the look in his eyes said something different. I told myself I was overthinking, that he was just joking. After all, he did so much for me. He'd built me a whole art studio, for crying out loud. That wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't care. Then came the night that changed everything. We were at a small gathering with his friends, and as the evening wore on, I started talking with a friend of his from college. A genuinely nice guy, nothing flirty. But every time I looked over, Daniel was watching us, his eyes cold. When we left, he was quiet, his jaw set in that way I'd come to recognize as his way of holding something back. Later, in his car, he broke the silence with a low, tight voice. "You seemed pretty into talking with Matt tonight," he said. I laughed, assuming he was kidding, but he didn't laugh back. "It just seems like you have plenty of time and attention for other people," he added, his tone clipped. I didn't know how to respond, stunned that he'd interpret an innocent conversation that way. He kept going, saying things that made me feel like I'd done something wrong. The worst part was that he kept saying he was only mentioning it because he cared about me and wanted us to be close, that he didn't want to feel like he was competing for my attention. I found myself apologizing, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I wanted him to feel reassured. I wanted to keep the peace. That night, after he dropped me off, I lay awake feeling drained and confused. How had a guy who made me feel so loved, so safe, suddenly turn into someone who made me second-guess myself? Over the next few weeks, the same pattern emerged, like a slow unweaving of our connection. One morning, when he saw me dressed up for a work event, he made a comment about how I seemed to dress differently when he wasn't around. I asked him what he meant, and he shrugged, saying, "I just don't see why you're always trying to impress people who aren't me." He'd say it lightly, almost as if he was teasing, but there was an edge, a strange seriousness in his words that left me feeling guilty without knowing why. As months passed, I started noticing more signs, tiny, almost invisible things that chipped away at the certainty I'd once felt. He'd sometimes scroll through my social media, making comments on old photos or asking who people were. He He was never outright accusatory, but it was like he was cataloging, building up some unspoken case. Even my family started noticing how he'd turn quiet when I talked about plans that didn't involve him. They'd ask me if everything was all right, and I'd brush it off with a smile, telling them he was just protective. The pivotal moment, though, came one evening when I received a job offer in a different city. I was excited, nervous, and had been going over every possibility in my head before finally telling him. When I shared the news, his face went blank. He didn't congratulate me or ask any questions about the job. Instead, he said, "So, I guess your life here isn't that important to you after all." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I explained that it was just an offer, that I hadn't even decided, but he interrupted, his tone clipped. "If you cared about us, you wouldn't even consider leaving." The argument that followed was brutal, with him saying things I couldn't believe, accusing me of being selfish, of not valuing what we had. For the first time, I saw a side of him that was possessive, controlling, and unwilling to even consider what was best for me. It was as if the veil had finally lifted. All those little remarks, the seemingly harmless possessiveness, it wasn't protectiveness or passion. It was control. He wanted me in his orbit, on his terms, no exceptions. I left that night feeling more alone than I'd felt in years. So here I am now, weeks after breaking it off, still questioning everything. Was it my fault for not seeing the signs sooner? Could I have done something differently? Or was this doomed from the start? I'm left wondering, how do you know when red flags outweigh green flags? And is it ever worth going back when things feel so tangled between the good and the bad? I'd love to hear your experiences. A couple of months ago, something strange happened. I came home early from work, excited about this restaurant that had just opened. I wanted to tell him about it and plan a spontaneous date night, something we hadn't done in ages. When I walked in, he was on the couch, scrolling on his phone. He barely looked up, just muttered a hey, and went back to his screen. I stood there, waiting for him to ask why I was home so early or to notice that I brought his favorite bottle of wine with me. But he didn't even glance up again. It was in that silence that I felt a cold realization. We had become something unrecognizable. The person who used to make me laugh and look at me like I was the only one in the room was now sitting just a few feet away, but might as well have been a stranger. I didn't say anything that night, just pretended everything was fine. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly between us. We still went through our routines, grocery shopping, watching Netflix on the weekends, making small talk at dinner, but there was this gap that seemed to widen with every passing day. I kept wondering if I was the only one who felt it, or if he just accepted it as our normal. It was like living with a ghost. I remember this one night when we were brushing our teeth side by side. Our eyes met in the mirror, but instead of warmth, all I saw was someone who felt distant. It wasn't sadness or anger, just this emptiness. He looked away, and I felt this pang in my chest, like I was standing next to someone I once knew but had somehow lost. I kept trying to brush it off, hoping it was just a rough patch, a phase that would pass if I ignored it long enough. But the harder I tried to convince myself, the more painfully obvious it became. We were slipping away from each other, and I didn't know how to stop it. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of all the ways we'd stopped connecting. We used to talk for hours about anything and everything, but now our conversations felt shallow, scripted. I'd ask him about his day, and he'd give me a one-word answer, then drift back into his own world. Even the little gestures we used to share, things I'd once taken for granted, were gone. He'd stopped holding my hand in the car, and I couldn't remember the last time we'd stayed up late laughing or even had a genuine conversation. One evening, I suggested we go out for a walk, hoping that maybe we just needed a change of scenery. But halfway through, I realized we hadn't spoken a single word. He was walking ahead of me, lost in his own thoughts, and I felt this crushing loneliness. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would bridge the growing distance between us, but the words just wouldn't come. I realized that I didn't know how to reach him anymore, and maybe he didn't know how to reach me either. The breaking point came during an argument over something ridiculous. I can't even remember what started it. Something about forgetting to pick up groceries or leaving dirty dishes in the sink. But before I knew it, we were both shouting, throwing accusations at each other. I accused him of not caring, of giving up on us, and he accused me of being too distant, too hard to please. In the heat of the moment, he said something that stopped me cold. I feel like we're just going through the motions. Do you even still want this? The words echoed in my head long after he'd said them. I'd been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but the truth was, I didn't know if I did. I loved him, or at least I loved the memory of what we used to be, but I didn't know if I was still in love with the person he'd become. And the look on his face told me he felt the same way. We didn't speak for days after that argument. The silence between us was suffocating, but at the same time, I was too afraid to break it. I think we were both hoping that if we ignored it long enough, things would magically go back to the way they were. But deep down, we knew that wasn't going to happen. Finally, one Saturday morning, I couldn't take it anymore. We were sitting across from each other at breakfast, each of us wrapped up in our own thoughts. I put my coffee down and took a deep breath, feeling my heart pound in my chest. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, and there was this flicker of sadness in his eyes. I think he knew what was coming. Maybe he'd been waiting for it, just like I had. "Yeah," he replied softly. "I think we do." What followed was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. We sat there, talking about everything we'd avoided for so long. How we'd grown apart, how we'd both been holding on out of habit more than anything else. He told me he missed the way we used to be, that he didn't know how we'd let things get so distant. And I admitted that I felt the same way, but I didn't know if we could ever get back to the connection we once had. It was like we were both mourning the loss of something we'd spent years building, and now we had to let it go. By the end of that conversation, there were no more tears left to cry. We sat there side by side, feeling this strange mix of relief and heartbreak. We both knew it was the right decision, but that didn't make it any less painful. The next few days were a blur. We started the slow, painful process of separating our lives, dividing up belongings, canceling shared subscriptions, and figuring out what came next. Some moments felt like they'd crush me, like when I found an old photo of us from one of our first trips together, laughing and holding hands, looking so genuinely happy. I almost wanted to rip it up, but instead, I packed it away with a heavy heart. The first night on my own was the hardest. The apartment felt empty, the silence almost deafening without him there. I kept catching myself reaching for my phone to text him about something silly, only to remember that he wasn't just a message away anymore. I spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a mistake or if this was truly the beginning of something new. In the weeks that followed, I slowly started finding my footing. I began exploring old hobbies, signing up for classes I'd always wanted to try, and taking long walks to clear my head. Some days, I felt like I was moving forward. Other days, I'd feel the familiar ache of missing him, of wondering if we could have saved it if we tried harder. But gradually, I started realizing that letting go was allowing me to discover parts of myself I'd lost over the years. And now, here I am, still healing, still figuring out what comes next. There are moments when the loneliness creeps in, and I wonder if I'll ever find something like that again. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finding myself learning to be okay on my own. For anyone who's been through something like this, how did you cope with the emptiness? Did you find something valuable in the experience, or does the pain ever really fade? I'd really appreciate any advice, or just knowing I'm not alone in this.